The gale howled across the Wyoming high country, carrying early-season snowflakes as sharp as shards of broken glass. At Blackwood Ranch, sitting lonesome in a valley hemmed in by gray limestone cliffs, the usual silence was ripped apart by the shrieking wilderness. Sarah Miller sat motionless at a rugged oak table, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows against the age-stained timber walls. Across her lap, a Winchester Model 1873 lay quiet, its cold metal brushing against the felt of her worn black dress. It had been 6 months since she buried her husband Thomas under the cedar tree behind the house. In those months, Blackwood had ceased to be a home. It had become a fortress of gloom. Sarah had learned to love the solitude, or at least how to keep it from killing her every night. She trimmed the wick, her weary blue-gray eyes scanning the frost-blurred window. Outside, the darkness was thick as pitch, with only the wind slamming against the siding like invisible hands trying to muscle their way inside. "Nay, gut!" A horse's whinny rang out, stray and terrified, piercing through the storm. Sarah bolted upright, her index finger instinctively finding the trigger guard. That wasn't old Barnaby's voice from the stable. The next strange noise came from the barn, a sharp crash, metal striking stone. Sarah stood, her movements deliberate even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She threw on a heavy wool cloak, donned her wide-brimmed hat, and cinched the strap tight under her chin. She didn't light the lantern. In this neck of the woods, a light at night was nothing more than a bullseye for strangers. She nudged the front door open, and the cold rushed in like a wild beast, seizing the breath from her lungs. The yard was so dark she had to navigate by memory alone. Sarah slipped through the split-rail fence, heading toward the barn. The double doors were swung wide, rattling against the frame. Inside, the scent of dry hay mingled with something foreign and pungent, the smell of blood and hot horse sweat. "Who's there?" Sarah called out, her voice raspy but hard as nails. She shouldered the Winchester, the black muzzle leveled at the hayloft in the darkest corner. A low groan answered her. "Don't shoot." Under the faint light reflecting off the snow outside, a figure was crawling across the dirt floor. It was a man. He wore a buffalo hide coat, drenched and caked in mud. His horse stood nearby, head hanging low, flanks heaving from exhaustion. The man collapsed face first into the straw, his breath wheezing like a busted pair of bellows. Sarah stepped closer, keeping a safe distance. She used the toe of her boot to give his shoulder a firm nudge. The man rolled over, and in the dim light Sarah caught her breath. His face was rugged, covered in a coarse beard, but his eyes, a blue as deep as a stormy ocean, were glazed with pain. A streak of bright red blood had soaked through his left shoulder, spreading across his duster. "I'm unarmed," he whispered, his right hand trembling as it rose in a weak plea before he went completely under. Sarah stood frozen for a moment. Her frontier survival instinct told her to leave him be, or finish him off to save herself the trouble. A stranger carrying lead always meant someone else was hot on his heels. But looking at his pale face, she saw something familiar, not the face itself, but the utter exhaustion of a hunted soul. She lowered the rifle. "Damn it all, Thomas is going to give me an earful for this." Sarah had to use every ounce of her strength, gritting her teeth as she dragged the man into the house. His weight nearly buckled her knees during the short trek from the barn to the kitchen. Once inside, she bolted the door tight and drew the curtains shut. She laid him on the floor near the hearth, where the heat was starting to radiate. As Sarah cut away the layers of leather and flannel to check the wound, her brow furrowed. A slug had torn through the soft tissue of his shoulder, and blood was still seeping out slow. But what made her shiver was that the bullet was still lodged inside, pressed against the collarbone. She picked up a spare round from the table, comparing the caliber to the hole in the man. "44-40 lead, hot-loaded," she muttered. This was expensive ammunition, usually favored by professional gunslingers or a big rancher's hired muscle. In this valley, only one outfit used this load, Baron Sterling's regulators. The memory of Sterling made Sarah's stomach churn. He was the one who had sent threatening letters demanding to buy Blackwood for pennies, on the dollar, for 2 years. He was the one who sneered when Thomas died in a riding accident. She never believed was real. If this man had been shot by Sterling's men, it meant he was either an enemy of Sterling or a traitor. Either way, it meant certain death if she was caught harboring him. Sarah got to work. She boiled water and grabbed the meager medical kit Thomas once used for the livestock. She poured a splash of strong whiskey onto the stranger's wound. He lurched, a groan escaping his purple lips, though his eyes stayed shut. Sarah used the forceps, her hand shaking a fraction, but her mind stayed steady. She felt metal hit something hard. A small clink. She bit her lip, gave a slight twist, and pulled the bullet out. The slug dropped into a tin bowl with a dry thud. While cleaning the blood, Sarah's hand brushed against a hard object in the man's inner pocket. Curiously, she pulled it out. It was a small photograph kept in a thin, cracked wooden frame. In the photo was a young boy, maybe 5 years old, grinning wide under an oversized cowboy hat. On the back, a message was written in neat, faded ink, "To Papa from Caleb, 1880." A pang of bitterness rose in Sarah's chest. This man was a father, a man on the run who still carried his son's smile in the pocket closest to his heart. She gently tucked the photo back where she found it. Her initial suspicion gave way to a strange sense of kinship. She spent the whole night keeping watch over him. She piled on more blankets and occasionally pressed a warm cloth to his forehead as the fever began to set in. In his delirium, he mumbled incoherent names and broken warnings about the devil down in the canyon. As dawn began to break, the gray Wyoming sunrise tried to push through the heavy snow on the window panes. The man's eyes snapped open. His first reaction wasn't confusion, but high alert. He tried to bolt up, but the shoulder wound sent him crashing back down, a hiss of pain escaping his teeth. "Stay put, unless you want those stitches to pop," Sarah said, sitting in the chair across from him, her rifle still resting on her lap. The man scanned the room, then looked down at his shoulder, neatly bandaged in white gauze. His gaze settled on Sarah. The tension in those deep blue eyes eased slightly when he saw the tired but steely face of the woman before him. You saved me?" His voice was as gravelly as a dry creek bed. "I saved a stranger who broke into my barn," Sarah corrected. "What's your name? And why does Sterling's crew want to turn you into a sieve?" The man went silent for a beat, trying to take a sip of water from the tin cup Sarah offered. Jude Rollins. And as for why they shot me, let's just say I made off with something Sterling considers his soul." "The man doesn't have a soul," Sarah replied flatly. Jude looked deep into Sarah's eyes, then up at the photos on the mantel, the photos of Thomas. He saw the emptiness in the house, the neglect of the fields visible through the glass. He saw the way she held that rifle, not like a frightened woman, but like someone who'd grown used to holding her own when there was nobody left to lean on. "You should have let me die out there," Jude said, his voice dropping low and serious. "Sterling's hounds never quit. They know I'm hit, and they'll sniff out the blood trail all the way here." Sarah stood up, walked to the window, and nudged the curtain aside. On the whitewashed yard, her footprints and the drag marks from last night had been mostly erased by the blizzard. But not entirely. A dark smudge still lingered under the thin layer of fresh powder. "I ain't scared of Sterling," Sarah said, though she knew she was partly lying. "He's already taken enough from me. If he wants another body at Blackwood, it's going to cost him a hell of a lot of his men's blood." Jude struggled into a sitting position, leaning against the table leg. He looked at Sarah with a newfound respect. He saw a woman with nothing left to lose, and that was the most dangerous kind of person in the world. "I came here yesterday just looking for a hole to crawl into and die," Jude whispered, his eyes turning cold and sharp. "But if you're hell-bent on keeping me alive, then we'd better get ready. You're right, Sterling don't have a soul, but he's got eyes and ears everywhere. Tomorrow, or maybe as soon as this afternoon, the devils will be knocking at your door." The warmth from the hearth wasn't enough to shake the chill spreading from Jude Rollins' warnings. Sarah Miller stood frozen by the window, her fingers gripping the coarse fabric of the curtain. Outside, the Wyoming Valley emerged under the pale morning light, thick bands of white mist snaking through the rock crevices like giant serpents. Blackwood had never looked so lonesome. "You said the devils are coming." Sarah turned, her gaze locking onto the man sitting on the floor. "Sterling usually sends his foreman, a man named Miller, no relation to my husband, out here. But he usually brings 2 outriders. You're saying there's more?" Jude stifled a groan as he tried to flex his right hand, testing the mobility of his fingers. Sterling's clean out of patience for polite talk, Miss Miller. The men he sent after me are hired guns. If they get wind that I'm here, they won't knock. They'll burn this place to the ground to smoke me out. He looked down at his bandaged wound, then scanned the kitchen. His eyes stopped on a stack of dusty law books on a high shelf, nestled between jars of strawberry jam and dried garlic. It was a detail that sat sideways in a frontier cattle ranch. Your husband, was he a reading man? Jude asked, his voice shifting, losing some of the growl of a wounded animal. Thomas wanted to be more than just a cowpuncher, Sarah replied, her voice dropping. He collected those on trips to Cheyenne. Said the law was the only thing that could keep this land from falling to men like Sterling. Funny how the law didn't do a lick of good for him in the end. Jude went quiet for a long stretch. He forced himself up, leaning against the oak table to keep his balance. Though his face was still pale, the way he stood tall with his shoulders back carried a heavy-duty authority that didn't belong to a common drifter. The law is a tool, Jude said softly, his deep blue eyes fixed on the books. But in Wyoming, that tool usually gets bent by whoever's holding the handle. I know because I used to be the one holding it. Before I picked up a gun, I stood in courtrooms in Denver. Sarah was stunned. She looked at the weathered man, his hands calloused and scarred by lead, trying to picture him in a boiled shirt and tie before a judge. The contrast was night and day, but it explained the razor-sharp edge he carried. A long road west, she whispered. Then why are you here, bleeding out and on the dodge? Because sometimes justice ain't in those pages, Jude pointed toward the shelf. It's in who's faster on the draw. When my family was murdered over a land dispute, I thought I could win with words. I realized I'd backed the wrong horse. I traded the robe for this colt. The conversation was cut short by a dog barking in the distance. It was the neighbor's sheepdog 2 miles off, but the bark sounded an alarm. Jude instantly snapped back into high alert. He signaled Sarah to back away from the window. We're short on time. I need to scout the weak points of this house. Over the next 2 hours, despite his throbbing wound, Jude walked Sarah through the preparations. He wasn't just a gunman. He had the eye of a military architect. They'd braced the doors with cross beams. Jude showed her how to lay broken glass on the back windowsills as a tripwire for intruders. He climbed into the crawl space of the attic, checking potential shooting lanes. While Jude was busy with the defenses, Sarah went down to the root cellar for supplies. She tripped over an old tin box Thomas used for important papers. It had been pried open long ago, but a few scraps of parchment and a small black leather journal remained. Sarah opened the journal. Thomas's final entries appeared, jagged and shaky. Sterling came by again. He's talking about the Blackwood water rights. I don't feel right after having tea with him in town. Head is spinning. Must hide the plat maps. Sarah's heart hammered. She brought the book upstairs and handed it to Jude. He read it fast, his brow furrowing with grim intent. I figured as much, Jude said, his voice turning cold. Thomas didn't die from a fall. Don't feel right after tea. That's textbook low-dose arsenic. He was poisoning your husband to break his will before forcing him to sign. When Thomas wouldn't fold, he staged the accident. Sarah felt the floor go out from under her. The grief she'd been bottling up exploded into a white-hot rage. That son of a bitch, he killed him for a patch of dirt. It ain't just the dirt. Jude flipped through the boundary notes. It's the water. Blackwood sits right on the aquifer that feeds the lower valley. Whoever holds Blackwood holds the lifeblood of every head of cattle in the territory. Sterling wants an empire, and your ranch is the final key. Right then, the thunder of hoofbeats rolled up the trail. Jude drew his Colt, flattening himself against the wall by the front door. Sarah grabbed the Winchester, the cold steel biting into her palms. Horses pulled up in the middle of the yard. A voice rang out, commanding and full of venom. Mrs. Miller, I know you're in there. We saw the smoke from your chimney all the way from the tree line. Sarah peeked through the curtain. It was Miller Sterling's foreman, along with 4 heavy hitters. They all had rifles boot deep in their scabbards, eyes scanning the outbuilding. Keep your head, Jude whispered in her ear, his breath hot. Get out there. Don't let 'em see you sweat. I'll be right here under the floorboards. If I see 'em go for leather, I'm opening up. Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. She pushed the door open and stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand but pointed at the dirt. What do you want, Miller? I told you I'm not selling Blackwood, Sarah said firmly, the wind whipping her hair, her eyes unblinking. Miller gave a dry chuckle, stroking his goatee. Mrs. Miller, you sure are hard-headed. We aren't here about the sale today. We're hunting a dangerous outlaw, a drifter who made off with some of Mr. Sterling's private papers and plugged one of our boys. He's hit bad, and the blood trail leads right to this valley. He dismounted, taking a few steps toward the porch. His men spread out, hands hovering near their holsters. I haven't seen any outlaws, Sarah replied coldly. Just me and my lonesome. Maybe that blood you saw was from a buck the wolves got a hold of. Is that right? Miller stopped at the base of the wooden steps. He took a foul sniff of the air. I could swear I smell gunpowder and beef stew coming from your kitchen. Seems like a lot of cooking for one lonely widow. He put a boot on the first step. Sarah gripped the stock. Right beneath his feet, Jude was crouched in the narrow crawl space under the porch, his finger already taking up the slack on the trigger, waiting for Miller to make one more move so he could put a hole through the man's foot. Back off, Miller. Sarah levered around, the mechanical clack-clack of the Winchester echoing in the silence. You don't have a warrant. Take one more step, and I'm treating it as criminal trespass. Miller froze, looking at the muzzle leveled at his chest. He saw the fire in Sarah's eyes, a light he hadn't seen before. He knew the widow wasn't playing house anymore. Fine, Mrs. Miller. We'll be moving on. Miller backed away, swinging back onto his horse. But mark my words, Sterling don't take kindly to being told no, and he likes harborers of criminals even less. We'll be watching. If that man is in there, he's just bringing death to your doorstep. The crew wheeled their horses and galloped off in a cloud of dust and slush. Sarah stood there until the hoofbeats vanished behind the pines. Her knees buckled, and she would have hit the boards if Jude hadn't scrambled out and caught her. You did good, Jude said, his eyes still fixed on the trail. But he's right about one thing. They're going to be watching. They aren't going far. He led her inside and slammed the door. Jude went straight to the table where Thomas's journal lay open. He pointed to the notes on the boundaries and water. Sarah, listen, he called her by name for the first time. We can't just sit here and wait for them to come back with an army. Sterling is holding forged papers to seize the water, but Thomas hinted that the original plat maps and the water compacts from your father's time still exist. If we get our hands on him, we can take him to the cleaners in county court before he can use his guns. Sarah looked at Jude, her fear giving way to a new resolve. Where do you think they are? In the records office at Creek Bed, Jude replied, his eyes flashing with a laurely sharpness. And likely in Sterling's private safe in town. That's where all the ghosts of this valley are locked up. Then we're going to go get them, Sarah said flatly. Darkness swallowed the Wyoming valley as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks. The snow began to fall in earnest, dusting over the hoofprints left by Sterling's men. Inside the Blackwood kitchen, Jude Rollins cinched a leather strap tight across his chest to steady his bunged-up shoulder. His face was a mask of pain, but his eyes burned with a grim, hell-bent resolve. We're taking Devil's Canyon, Jude said, his voice low and urgent. It's the only stretch Sterling's boys won't be riding herd on. They figure I'm too busted up to scale those rim rocks. Sarah Miller didn't waste words. She was busy stuffing crude black powder charges and a few crusts of hardtack into her saddlebags. She traded her morning black for a rugged set of bullhide riding gear, her golden hair tucked tight under a wide-brimmed hat. When she looked up, Jude saw a total transformation. She wasn't the grieving widow by the hearth anymore. She was a bona fide frontier spitfire. Creekbed is 15 miles of rough timber, Sarah said, checking the magazine on her Winchester. If we light out now, we'll hit town before the land office opens. But Sheriff Wade is in Sterling's pocket. He'll string us up on the spot if he catches us sniffing around that safe. That's why we aren't using the front door, Jude smirked, a hollow, humorless grin. I know the layout of these territorial offices. They always have a vent shaft running from the records vault out to the back alley. They slipped away from the ranch in graveyard silence. The two horses trudged through the fresh powder, their breath pluming like white ghosts in the frozen air. Devil's Canyon loomed ahead like the gaping maw of a limestone beast. The trail was narrow and steep sheer rock on one side, a straight drop to perdition on the other. As they reached the canyon rim, Jude reined in abruptly. He signaled for silence. In the distance, lanterns flickered like swamp fire along the main valley road. "They're out for blood," Jude whispered. Sterling's doubled his riders. "He's spooked by what I'm carrying." "And just what is that?" Sarah asked, her eyes boring into him. "You said you took something he considers his soul." "What is it?" Jude paused, the wind whistling through the rocks like a lonesome dirge. He pulled a small ledger from his coat lining, its corners stiff with dried gore. "It's a pay-no-mind list. Every bribe Sterling's paid to the notaries and judges in Cheyenne to grease these land grabs over the last 5 years. Your husband's name, Thomas Miller, is on the last page, under unfinished business." A fire ignited in Sarah's chest that set her to shaking. She spurred her horse forward, all doubt cast to the wind. They hammered through black timber where the shadows felt thick enough to swallow horse and rider whole, until the dim lights of Creek Bed winked on the horizon. The town at midnight was as quiet as a Boot Hill cemetery. Their horses' hooves, muffled with felt wraps, padded softly over the slushy main street. They ditched the mounts in a derelict stable behind the hotel and made tracks for the wood-frame buildings. The land office was a rare red brick structure sitting tall next to the jailhouse. Jude led Sarah to the rear, navigating through a mess of scrapwood and refuse. He pointed to a narrow, rusted iron grate near the foundation. "You're the smaller of us. You're going in," Jude whispered, handing her a small oil lamp and a ring of skeleton keys. "Look for the drawer marked Lot 42, North Valley. That's the original Blackwood deed." "I'll keep a lookout." Sarah nodded, squeezing her frame through the tight opening with a struggle. Inside, the office reeked of old parchment and ink. Her tiny lamp cast long, eerie shadows against the towering shelves. Her heart hammered like a trapped bird as she located the right drawer. She dug through the dry sheaves of paper, sweat beading on her brow despite the cellar chill. Finally, her fingers grazed an old vellum mat. It was the genuine article, bearing the raised federal seal from 30 years back, confirming permanent water rights for Blackwood Ranch. Beneath it, she found a crisp white sheet where Thomas's signature looked all wrong. It was too perfect, like it was traced by a dead hand. "You bastard," she hissed. This was the forged bill of sale Sterling meant to use to jump her claim. Just then noise erupted from the floor above. The thud of boots on floorboards and loud, coarse laughter. "Sheriff says Rawlins is bound to make a play for this place," a strange voice boomed. "Keep an eye on the safe. Sterling'll pay a king's ransom if we bag him." Sarah blew out the lamp. She held her breath, pressing herself into the gap between two filing racks. Footsteps approached the cellar stairs. The glow from a stranger's lantern began to bleed down the creaking wooden steps. Outside, Jude heard the commotion. He knew Sarah was in a tight spot. He couldn't go loud with his hardware or he'd wake the whole town. But he needed a distraction. Seeing a straw-laden wagon parked near the jail, Jude pulled a small powder charge, lit the fuse, and tossed it under the buckboard. Boom! The blast wasn't a world-ender, but it shattered the midnight calm. Flames roared up from the straw, lighting up the street like high noon. "Fire! The jail's burning!" Jude hollered, throwing his voice like a panicked drunk. The guards inside the land office bolted. "What the hell? Get out there!" They scrambled out the front, leaving the dark cellar behind. Sarah seized her one-in-a-million chance, tucked the map and the forgeries into her tunic, and scrambled back out the grate. Jude grabbed her hand, hauling her toward the stables. "Did you get 'em?" he asked as they hit the saddles. "The real deal and the fakes," Sarah panted. But the silence didn't last. A siren whistle shrieked from the jailhouse. The firelight from the wagon had caught the silhouettes of two riders tearing out of town. "Hold it right there! They robbed the land office," Sheriff Wade's voice bellowed. A volley of lead erupted from behind. "Bullets!" hissed past her ears like pissed-off hornets. Jude and Sarah pushed their horses into a dead gallop toward the limestone canyon. It was a life-or-death race now. Sterling's regulators were dead-a shots, and they were riding the fastest horseflesh in the territory. "Into the notch!" Jude yelled as they hit the canyon mouth. The canyon walls closed in, forming a narrow corridor barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast. The thunder of pursuit echoed off the rock like a stampede. Jude twisted in his saddle, his Colt spitting fire. One pursuer cartwheeled off his mount, hitting the rocks in a heap. But they were outnumbered. Another squad had taken a shortcut and was already lining the rimrock above, raining lead down on them. Shards of stones sprayed around Sarah. Her horse reared in terror, nearly bucking her into the abyss. "Jude, we're boxed in," Sarah screamed over the gunfire. Jude looked around, desperate. He spotted a goat trail zigzagging up the cliff face on the left, too narrow for horses. "Ditch the mounts. Climb," Jude barked. They leaped down, slapping the horses' rumps to keep them running forward as decoys. The two of them began to scramble up the treacherous rock. Jude's wound was weeping blood through his sleeve, his face gray with agony, but he used his one good arm to hoist Sarah upward. For a heartbeat, as they slipped out of the line of fire, Sarah turned to pull Jude onto a wide ledge. A bullet grazed her forearm, leaving a stinging, angry burr. She didn't let out a peep, just gripped Jude's hand tight. Their eyes met in that moment. Amidst the lead and the dark, between the cold and the grave, Sarah saw more than just a gunman's grit. In Jude, she saw the pain of a man who'd lost everything and was trying to save one last scrap of justice. And Jude saw a brand of backbone in Sarah he hadn't seen in any man he'd ever ridden with. "Why go through all this for me?" Sarah whispered, their breath mingling. "Because I watched my family die, because I wasn't brave enough to break the law," Jude replied, his voice low and trembling. "I ain't letting history repeat itself on you." They reached the top and hunkered behind a massive boulder. Below, Wade's men were milling about, confused by the riderless horses. "Find 'em! They can't get far with that shoulder," Wade's voice echoed up from the gut of the canyon. Sarah pulled her Winchester, resting it on the rock shell. She looked down at the target 200 yards out in the pale moonlight. Sheriff Wade was standing right under a henchman's lantern. It was a long shot for any normal soul in this light. Sarah took a deep breath, letting it out slow. She remembered Thomas teaching her to shoot on the Blackwood Flats. "Don't shoot with your eyes, shoot with the feel of the mark," he'd said. Crack, the round tore through the air. The lantern and the henchman's hand exploded, spraying coal oil all over Wade and his goons, turning them into a ring of fire. Men scrambled, horses bucked, and pure bedlam took over the canyon floor. "Let's move." Jude grabbed Sarah's hand. They crossed the high plateau, trekking for 2 hours on foot as the snow turned into a full-blown blizzard. By the time they found a small cave for shelter, they were both spent. Sarah slumped down, clutching the precious papers to her chest. Jude leaned against the cave wall, his breath coming in ragged wheezes. He looked over at Sarah, seeing her tearing a strip of her shirt to bind the graze on her arm. No whining, no tears. "You're a hell of a shot, Miss Miller," Jude said, a warm spark lighting his tired eyes. "I told you." Sarah looked at him, a faint smile touching her lips. "If Sterling wants blood, he's gonna have to pay the piper." The snow falling outside the cave was no longer a soft rustle. It had surged into a roaring symphony of the fiercest blizzard the high country had seen in a decade. Inside, the meager fire Jude had coaxed from salvaged dry pine flickered, casting dancing shadows against the frigid limestone walls. Sarah Miller looked down at the stack of documents clutched in her lap, the ink and red wax seals looking like unhealed scabs on the face of the parchment. "Sterling won't let us draw a peaceful breath come morning." Jude broke the silence, his voice raspy as the fever began to gnaw at his bones. He was struggling to peel back the blood-stiffened bandage on his shoulder to check the damage. The bleeding had tapered off, but the flesh around it was turning a mean shade of red, a bad omen for the trail ahead. Sarah drew closer, her hands trembling from the cold, but her eyes burning with a fresh, hard-edged resolve. "He doesn't just want the papers. He wants us erased. Tonight in Creek Bed we slapped him in the face in front of the whole town. Sterling is a man who values his pride more than human life, which is why he'll hire cleaners." Jude narrowed his eyes at the whiteout beyond the cave mouth. "He's done with those clumsy ranch hands. He'll call in Snake Eyes Miller's gang, or some hired guns out of Cheyenne. Those boys don't give a damn about the law. They only care about leaving no witnesses to tell the tale. Then we'll show them that Blackwood isn't some shanty they can just kick over. Sarah stood, brushing the frost from her coat. We have to beat them back to the ranch. If a fight's coming, I want it on my own dirt, where I know every cut bank and every dark corner of the barn. They slipped out of the cave before the storm broke. The trek back to Blackwood was a gut-wrenching test of survival. Jude rode the pack horse they'd found at the timberline, while Sarah led the other, both of them plowing through a fog so thick it felt like salt. When the roof line of Blackwood finally emerged under the murky moon, it looked like a shipwreck in a sea of white. The second they stepped inside, Jude didn't allow for a moment's rest. He began directing Sarah, turning the cozy log home into a kill zone. Gather every drop of coal oil you've got, Jude barked, as he used a Bowie knife to notch small loopholes into the timber walls, just wide enough for a rifle barrel. Pour 'em into ceramic jars. Plug the necks with felt. We're making fire pots if they crowd us too close. Sarah worked like a machine. She hauled out the sticks of dynamite Thomas had used to blast rock for the irrigation ditches, carefully tamping them under the snow by the main gate, trailing the fuses all the way back to the kitchen. She stacked heavy grain sacks high against the windowsills, creating solid breastworks against incoming lead. I'm taking the attic, Sarah said, her voice steady as a rock. I can cover the north pasture from up there. If they come from the canyon, I'll spot 'em before they hit the fence line. Jude looked at the woman standing before him. In the long, rolled-out glow of the lantern, Sarah Miller bore no trace of a fragile widow. She was the very soul of frontier grit. Sarah, Jude called softly as her foot hit the first step. If this goes south, if I can't hold the line downstairs, you take that bolt hole in the cellar we cleared last night. Don't look back. Just get those papers to the governor's office in Cheyenne. Sarah looked at him, a flicker of sorrow crossing her gray eyes. I'm done running, Jude. Tonight, either Blackwood stands or I lay down next to Thomas. You aren't the only one with a score to settle in this valley. Near 4 in the morning, the air went dead quiet. The wind quit its howling, leaving only the crunch of frozen crust under the boots of men drawing near. From the attic vent, Sarah peered through her husband's old brass telescope. A line of silhouettes was ghosting out from the black pines. 10 men, maybe 12. They carried no lights, but the moonlight reflecting off the snow made their long guns shine with a deadly glint. They're here, Sarah whispered through the floorboards. Down in the kitchen, Jude gave the cylinder of his Colt one last spin. He blew out the final lamp. Darkness swallowed the room, leaving only the hammer of his heart and the pop of the dying embers in the heart. Snap. The sound of a dry branch breaking under a boot right by the porch. Crack. The opening act didn't come from the raiders, but from the attic. Sarah had opened up. A shadow crumpled in the middle of the yard, dark blood spraying across the pristine white snow. Instantly, a volley of rifle fire shredded the house window. Glass shattered and lead hissed through the air, thudding into the logs like tearing silk. Left side, they're flanking the barn, Jude yelled as he saw muzzle flashes at the back door. He squeezed the trigger, his Colt barking rhythmically. A hired hand shrieked in agony as a slug caught him center mass, sending him tumbling into the woodpile. The fight turned vicious and chaotic. Sterling's mercenaries weren't greenhorns. They moved in small fire teams, leapfrogging and pinning the house down. A firebomb hit the porch, and blue-white flames erupted, starting to lick at the seasoned timber of Blackwood. They're torching the place. Sarah screamed, never ceasing her fire. Every one of her shots was a reckoning. Another man dropped as he tried to vault the rail into the stable. Smoke began to choke the house, thick with the stench of tar and burning pine. Jude felt his lungs seize, his shoulders screaming as if someone were driving a red-hot spike into the bone. He saw a tall man in a low-crowned hat, the lead dog, Snake Eyes Miller, carrying a massive torch toward the front door. "Not today, you son of a bitch," Jude muttered. He yanked the fuse cord Sarah had rigged. Boom! An earth-shattering blast rocked the foundation. The powder under the entryway detonated, launching Snake Eyes and 2 of his goons into the air. Stone and slush rained down. The house shuddered as if it had been backhanded by a giant. But the dance wasn't over. A trio of raiders used the blast as cover to rush the back window. They kicked through the wooden shutters and swarmed into the kitchen. Jude was thrown into a Donnybrook. A man swung a rifle butt at his head. Jude ducked, drawing his skinning knife and driving it deep into the man's thigh. He spun, emptying the Colt into a second man at point-blank range. However, the third man managed to drive a hunting knife into Jude's side. Jude let out a ragged gasp, blood flecking his lips. Using every ounce of his remaining strength, he locked the killer's arm and shoved him backward into the roaring fireplace. "Joe Eade," Sarah barreled down from the attic. Her Winchester was dry, so she used the heavy walnut stock to buffalo gal the killer trying to finish Jude off. The two stood in a kitchen choked with smoke and fire. Outside, the survivors were tucking tail, broken by the savage resistance and the hellish explosion. They hadn't counted on a widow and a broken man turning Blackwood into a slaughterhouse. Sarah knelt beside Jude, her face smeared with soot and gore. She frantically tore the tablecloth to plug the leak in his side. "You stay with me, Jude. You hear me?" Tears tracked through the grime on her face, the first sign of a crack in her armor. Jude managed a weak, bloody grin. "The house, it's gone, Sarah. Your memories." Sarah looked at the ceiling, where the rafters Thomas had hand-hewn were being devoured by orange tongues of fire. The pain of losing her home was real, but it didn't hold a candle to the fire in her gut. "Let it burn," she whispered, her voice hard as flint. "A house is just wood and stone. We're breathing, and we've still got the proof. Tomorrow, Sterling's gonna find out that a fire can't burn the truth." They leaned on each other, stumbling out of the inferno. Standing in the yard under a Wyoming sky turning the gray of dawn, Sarah watched Blackwood go up in flames. The ghosts of the valley had risen tonight, and they were demanding a brand of justice no forged contract could hide. "We gotta move," Jude whispered, leaning his full weight into her. "To town. The hearing. The hearing starts at 8. Sarah nodded. She hoisted him onto the horse, then swung up behind, holding him tight and pinning the documents to her chest. Behind them, Blackwood Ranch lit up the horizon like a funeral pyre. The trail from Blackwood Ranch back to Crete Bed felt 1,000 miles long under the dismal gray dawn. Sarah Miller hauled on the reins, one arm cinched tight around Jude Rollins' waist to keep him from sliding out of the saddle. The blood from the gouge in Jude's side had soaked through her wool coat, hot and sickening against the bone-deep Wyoming cold. Behind them, a column of thick black smoke from the burning house was being whipped, ragged by the wind, looking for all the world like a giant finger pointing toward heaven in accusation. "Don't you dare close your eyes, Jude," Sarah whispered into his ear, her breath pluming white. "You promised me you'd see Sterling hit the dirt." Jude answered only with a low grunt in his throat. His deep blue eyes were glassy, but his fingers remained locked in the horse's mane with a dying hard will to live. Crete Bed emerged as the sun began to crest the limestone peaks, casting a light that was cold and soulless. By 6 in the morning, the county courthouse, a two-story timber building with a bell tower already, had a scattering of farmers and cattlemen milling about. They stood in small knots, whispering about the explosion they'd heard echoing from the North Valley last night. The sight of Sarah and Jude on a single horse, ragged and blood-stained, brought a hush over the crowd. Sarah dismounted, using every bit of her strength to help Jude down. She hauled him toward the courthouse steps just as a polished, high-end carriage pulled up across the way. Stepping out was Baron Sterling. He wore an expensive tweed suit, a gold watch glinting from his waistcoat pocket, his face flushed and confident, as if he were headed to a victory banquet rather than a land-grab hearing. Sterling froze when he saw the two wrecked figures at the courthouse door. His eyes narrowed, a flash of pure shock crossing his face at the sight of Jude alive, but he quickly smoothed his features into his usual high and mighty mask. He offered a smile that was pure hemlock. "Mrs. Miller," Sterling called out, his voice booming across the square. "I heard tell of a fire Blackwood last night. A real tragedy. Perhaps you ought to have stayed to sift through the ashes instead of coming here to stir up trouble with this walking corpse." Sarah stopped in her tracks, standing tall and tilting her chin up at the most powerful man in the valley. "The ashes of Blackwood are going to be what buries your empire, Sterling. And this man isn't a corpse, he's the witness to your rot." The courthouse bell gave a dry toll. The heavy oak doors swung open. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with the smell of candle wax and old wood. Judge Higgins, a middle-aged man with a thick thicket of a beard, brought his gavel down to open the session at 8 sharp. Sterling sat at the front table with the city slicker lawyer out of Cheyenne. He confidently produced a stack of papers, claiming Thomas Miller had signed a promissory note and mortgaged the ranch to him 6 months before passing. This is Thomas Miller's signature, notarized by the town's own land office, Sterling's lawyer declared. Mrs. Miller hasn't the scratch to settle the debt, so ownership of Blackwood naturally falls to Mr. Sterling. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The farmers looked at each other with hopeless eyes. They'd seen this dog and pony show too many times before. I have an objection, Your Honor. Sarah stood from the gallery. She helped Jude hobble toward the stand. Mrs. Miller, do you have counsel? Judge Higgins asked with a furrowed brow. I do, Sarah said, looking at Jude. Jude Rollins clamped a hand over his wound, taking a lungful of air to push past the rolling waves of pain. He drew himself up, and in that heartbeat the aura of the big city attorney from Denver returned, razor sharp and commanding. Your Honor, my name is Jude Rollins, admitted to the bar of the Federal Supreme Court, Jude spoke, his voice thin but ringing clear to every corner of the room. I represent Mrs. Sarah Miller. We have evidence that the documents provided by the plaintiff are forgeries, plain and simple. Sterling scoffed, leaning back in his chair. A wanted outlaw wants to talk law? Now that's a howler. Quiet, Mr. Bassett. Sterling, Higgins barked, rapping his gavel. Mr. Rollins, what proof do you have? Sarah pulled the original plat map and the forged deed from her coat. She laid them on the judge's bench. Jude continued, his finger stabbing at the fine print. Look at the seal, Your Honor. It's the local notary's mark, but if you compare it to the original federal map we pulled from the Crete Bed archives, the one Mr. Sterling tried and failed to deep six, you'll see the difference. The seal on Sterling's note has a hairline fracture on the western edge. It's a flaw from a counterfeit casting mold the land office was muscled into using to churn out ghost deeds. Jude stopped, coughing raggedly, fresh blood staining his hand, but he pushed on. Furthermore, we have this pay no mind list. It's Mr. Sterling's own ledger, detailing payouts to Sheriff Wade and these very clerks to cook the books. Thomas Miller's name is on the final page, right next to a note about, "You're moving in." The courtroom erupted into a firestorm of shouts. Sterling bolted upright, his face turning from flush to a sickly gray. That's a lie. Those are stolen papers. They ain't got no legal standing. They stand when they expose a cold-blooded murder, Sterling, Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through the din. You poisoned my husband bit by bit with arsenic. I have his journal detailing every symptom. You aren't just a land thief, you're a killer. Judge Higgins pored over the documents, his face growing grim. He looked toward Sheriff Wade, who was standing in the corner. Wade was sweating bullets, cutting his eyes toward the back door, only to find two burly farmers blocking the way. Mr. Sterling, the judge said, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. These documents carry the original federal seal, something no local office has the right to tinker with. Thomas Miller's signature on this note has an ink density that doesn't match the date. It's clear it was signed when the man had lost motor control or was guided by a dead hand. Higgins looked out at the crowd, at the dozens of farm families waiting for a miracle. The court finds that Baron Sterling's claims to Blackwood Ranch are null and void due to fraud and forgery. This property belongs to Sarah Miller by right of legal inheritance. A roar of triumph went up in the court. Farmers stood and threw their hats toward the ceiling. In the chaos, Sterling snapped. He pulled a small hideout pistol from his coat, aiming it at Sarah with wild-eyed fury. If I can't have this valley, nobody will. But Jude Rollins was faster. Even gutted by a knife, his gunfighter instincts were bone deep. He tackled Sarah to the floor just as Sterling's piece barked. The lead thudded into the wall behind them. Before Sterling could get a second shot off, Jude cleared leather with his Colt. One surgical shot shattered Sterling's gun hand. The tycoon's pistol clattered to the floor. Sterling clutched his arm, howling in agony and disgrace. A federal marshal who just hit town following a tip from the night before marched in and slapped the irons on Sterling and Sheriff Wade. The jig is up, Sterling, the marshal said flatly. The courtroom slowly emptied as Sterling and his goons were hauled off. The morning sun had turned warmer, streaming through the high windows and washing over the tired but peaceful faces of Sarah and Jude. Weeks later, the snow had begun to retreat from the Wyoming hillsides. Blackwood Ranch was no longer a desolate ruin. With the help of the neighbors Sarah and Jude had saved, a new barn had been raised. The log house was being rebuilt, the charred rafters replaced with fresh pine that smelled of high country resin. Jude sat on the porch, his arms still in a sling but his color much improved. He was reading an old newspaper while Sarah stood by the vegetable garden, where she'd just turned the earth for the spring planting. "The court in Cheyenne accepted our evidence for your father's case in Flagstaff," Sarah said, walking over and resting a hand on his shoulder. "Your family's spread is being returned. You can go back home now." Jude lowered the paper, looking out over the greening pastures emerging from the melt. He saw Thomas's apple trees, the ones that survived the fire, starting to push out their first buds. "There's nobody waiting for me in Flagstaff, Sarah," Jude said softly. He took her hand, their calloused palms meeting, rough but warm. "Besides, Blackwood needs a man who knows how to fix a fence and maybe one who knows enough law to make sure nobody ever tries their luck here again." Sarah smiled, the first real bright smile since Thomas passed. She looked toward the distant rim rocks, where the stars of the night had given way to the brilliant light of a new day. "Then we better get to it," she said, her voice full of hope. "We need to clear that south pasture. I reckon 30 head of breeder cattle is a damn good start." Jude nodded, standing up and leaning into her. High above, a hawk took wing against the deep blue Wyoming sky. "Free and steady as she goes."